Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers. It's broadcast number 748, April the 7th, 1986. And I want to remind old listeners or new listeners that if you want the bibliography sheets, the sources of newspapers or magazines or addresses that I put on the air that you want to write for something or look it up, write to me, Mae, M-A-E, Brussels, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel, California, 93923. More of you are doing this, and I'm very happy about that and happy to give you the sources of information. So when you share these things with friends or family or whoever you, I hope, share them with and don't listen alone, you can pull out these sheets and keep them in chronological order in a 3-hole notebook and read them like a book at the end of the year. And then don't ask me, why don't you write a book and have your little sheets of paper all folded up in envelopes somewhere in the desk. Now, in the 23 years that I've done research, I've thought a lot about what's happening to this country, how the country was going to go. It's gone exactly as anticipated or expected if you've listened to this program any length of time. And if somebody were to say, what right now do you think would make any way change the course of this country and what is happening, which is a redundant question because people don't ask it. In the second place, they can't do it. So maybe I'm talking to myself or a handful of you. I would say, number one, open up the grave in Houston, Texas, that is named for Howard Hughes, and prove beyond any doubt, with not the Central Intelligence Agency or the Defense Department there, that the person in that grave is not Vance Cooper. I bring that up because this is the 10th anniversary of the time that a person was flown in from Acapulco, Mexico to Houston, Texas. It was April the 5th, 1976, 10 years ago. And I have reason to believe and have studied it very carefully for 10 years, every book and every article I could ever get on the Howard Hughes story and his personal friends, such as Terry Moore and other people who knew him that I've spent a lot of time with. I think that to get to the Howard Hughes empire is very, very important. Remember, he wanted to choose our presidents, and he handpicked Paul Laxalt, who was the GOP fundraiser for Ronald Reagan's last 2 elections. And Laxalt flies into the Philippines to appear as a hero of democracy, to escort Mr. Marcos out after going along with him all these years, and Ronald Reagan and Nancy very close to Fernando Marcos and the family and the politics and all the mafia money and all the dirty money and all the dirty tricks. Paul Laxalt looks very clean as he goes there to get Marcos out at the last moment because it's falling in anyway. But Laxalt is the fundraiser for this party. He raised the money to put Reagan in. He was handpicked by this unknown Hughes organization to eventually become president of the United States. If I had 3 wishes, I would ask the Congress of the United States to take FRITZ KRAEMER, the plans officer of the Pentagon, the man behind the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Central America, South America, the overthrow of Mossadegh, putting in the Shah, bringing with Henry Kissinger the narcotics traffic from the Middle East, Southeast Asia, South America with Reverend Moon, and the Korean and Taiwan mafia and death squads. I want Fritz KRAEMER fingerprinted publicly and prove that he is not Adolf Hitler's general. I would want that done if I had a second wish, and if I had a third, I would go thoroughly into Charles Willoughby and Albert Wiedemeyer and their role with Hitler's Kriegsakademie in Berlin and their linkage to Douglas MacArthur and Fritz KRAEMER and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. Those are diseases that we have developed in this country. They've grown like the serpent's egg. They are a cancer. And the reason I bring up the Hughes, and then I threw in 2 more wishes, as I say, is the 10th anniversary since that body was cashed in. There was an article in the Monterey Herald that may or may not have been syndicated by Robert Macy this week, and it goes into brief segments of Howard Hughes' life, and it tells how much property he bought in Las Vegas and elsewhere in Los Angeles and around the West Coast, not to mention the Medical Institute. His father invented a tool bit, a drill bit that turned rock into mud, and out of that, Howard began to get 50 to 60 million a year when he was 19 years old. There wasn't an oil company that could drill without the Hughes drill, and he had that amount of money. And in 1966, he sold his share to TWA, which he always wanted to own, and this is the beginning of the taking over of Vegas and the Mafia and Robert Mayu and the CIA, and taking the cash of a person who from 66 was never seen publicly, was in a Boston hospital, and this article mentions that he has all this cash. He checks out of a Boston hospital where there was this alleged brain surgery. He arrives in Vegas in the dark of night, leaves in 1970 and goes down to the Bahamas in the dark of night, is never seen by Chester Davis, Robert Mayu, or any person that had business dealings with him. It was a faceless body. So they took what he bought for $80 million, TWA, became $546 million, and with that cash, he then goes to Vegas. Now, the account says that Howard's first brush or contact with Robert Mayu was in 1954 when he was visible, which was true at that time. And Mayu was to investigate a woman that Howard would, in quotes, marry, Jean Peters. Now, there isn't a physical piece of truth or paper or anything to prove that Jean Peters married him in Tonopah, and that's a tiny town in Nevada, in 1957. And the cover story was that she divorced him in 1971, 14 years later, and 1947 was the year that he was buried off that Greek island, and Aristotle Onassis had him over there. Jackie Onassis, who was there at the time, got $26 million settlement from the Hughes estate, and Jean Peters got $26 million from the Hughes estate for this whole role where she also wasn't a part and never saw or had sex or was with a person named Howard Hughes. He was kept in a dark room with wood over the windows, and even airplanes or helicopters flying by just by chance couldn't get a picture of anybody in that room. Robert Mayu went on to hire the assassination teams that were involved in the murder of John Kennedy, not only picking Paul Laxalt, and Hughes was behind the early candidacy of Richard Nixon and the Lincoln Club when he got out of Navy intelligence, and he's been a man in the political scene for many, many years by reputation. But this is a faithless group of people, and if we could do anything like open up that grave and show that that is Vance Cooper in that grave, and Brooks Randall, one of his doubles, said that, and luckily I taped it with David Hartman years ago, that Brooks Randall was in that grave. I guess it was 10 years ago the discussion came up, and you could show how this government kidnaps people, takes their money, does the brain lobotomy in Boston, removes them, uses that $500 million, and parlays it into a way that they can eventually control the world. There was some confusion. David Emory was talking up on KFJC about the article I wrote about Howard Hughes being dead off a Greek island. I wrote that for Playgirl in 1974. I didn't get my information from reading a magazine. There was some disinformation or a wrong opinion. I wrote the article, and a woman named Stephanie Caruana came to my house, and she said, "What is the most important story you're doing?" And I said that Bruce Roberts in San Francisco in July of 72, pardon me, said that he gave me the whole entire gemstone file and said that I should investigate the Hughes story because Hughes had been buried off this Greek island, and he was the one who sent me at the time of Watergate to go back to all the back articles on Howard Hughes and all the books. And at the end of those 2 years, just 2 years of working on the Hughes story and the Watergate, I was convinced that Howard Hughes was dead at that time. So I was very anxious for when they would cash in the body. I used the term cash in, but when they flew it in 1976, and it was similar, the body was similar compared to a victim of a concentration camp. In fact, the Monterey Herald has the story. April the 5th, his Mormon assistants loaded Hughes' shriveled, comatose, drug-racked, 94-pound body on a stretcher and boarded a private airplane. They didn't want an autopsy in Mexico. For all purposes, he was dead. This is while he's running the multi-million-dollar medical institute in Florida, and none of his doctors sent him to any hospital where anyone could see this body, and it was identical to the absolute starvation with needles stuck in the arms. Even if a person is comatose, they don't ask for those needles. At that point, if he's comatose, they could fly him right to Houston to an American hospital. But they kept him there. He didn't ask to be 94 pounds and in that condition. That's all part of the BS lies that float around. And if we exhumed that, we would understand William Casey and William Donovan and Alan Dulles and the entire Defense Department CIA plot under the Hughes organization, as I said. Now, Freedom Magazine, published by the Scientologist, has articles on the Kennedy assassination this past issue. It just came out. Richard Sprague has written one called The Ultimate Cover-Up, the role of Jack Ruby and the CIA and the mind control. And then there's another article by Fletcher Prouty, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, who's been writing continuously for them, wonderful articles I haven't had time to share with you, on Eisenhower and the Bay of Pigs and the administration prior to Kennedy's administration and the role of those activists in the murder of Kennedy. But of course, you see, it goes back to the Hughes story that Howard hired. Under Howard, he wasn't conscious at all. The CIA used Mayhew and admitted we used a private organization so it wouldn't look like the CIA set up the mafia and the anti-Castro Cubans. And the bottom line of all of this is the story about Howard Hughes. Now, I know Richard Sprague and Colonel Prouty, Fletcher Prouty. I met him once, but we've corresponded through the years. And it is important, it's very important for new people to learn this back material. And what they're doing is invaluable. And I suggest you subscribe to Freedom Magazine. I've given you the address before. It's $12 a year. The address is 1301 North Catalina Street, Los Angeles, California, 90027. This is put out by the Scientologists. They have information on how to get the book on Interpol, J. Edgar Hoover with the Nazis, and they run continuous articles on mind control and the CIA mind control program. Dr. Thomas Satz writes for them almost every issue, SZASZ, and he talks about the illegal chemical and biological warfare testing. Well, it's a contradiction to say it is illegal chemical and biological warfare, because if it were illegal, they would be in jail. We wouldn't have advanced genetic sciences in Monterey County, and today California, tomorrow the world. It absolutely was legal because nobody has had a slap on the wrist for doing it, and they were all promoted. So it isn't any more illegal than blowing up the space shuttle Challenger. The next day they get a contract with the same people, the same inefficiency. It's perfectly legal. There's nothing abnormal in this country about drugging people. And it's not on the books that it's wrong, or if it's wrong, they go to jail. It's like 10 million illegal aliens. If we didn't let in 10 million, we had to let them in. You can slip a few through, but you can't slip 10 million. Therefore, the immigration department wants them. It's a contradiction to say it's illegal and have 10 million people here. Now, I'll get back, of course, through the years to the used material, but when these articles come out, and they're very pertinent, the real question is, who put in the Hughes organization? The 5 Mormon Mafia set up the Medical Institute, has the drugs for these things, the experimentations, can work on AIDS, can give AIDS, can have intense wiping out of populations. If we don't get back to Hughes and KRAEMER and Kissinger and Willoughby, there's no reason to write about any of these other things anymore because they're just simply academic. Now, a lot of people are asking me and calling, and you can't help miss the point that Dirty Harry will be mayor as of tomorrow of Carmel, California. Paul Laub, who had registered before Clint Eastwood, threw in his chance of running because he wasn't going to win anyway, and he didn't want to split the vote with Mr. Eastwood. Now, wherever you go, it's on the newsstands. And when I write checks now, I'm out of town, Carmel, they all look up. I don't know what they thought Carmel was before. The Monterey Herald has a picture from yesterday's rally. They had trouble getting together. The streets are small and there were too many people. It's the title of the picture with Clint Eastwood and the other candidate, Mrs. Townsend, is titled Meeting a Mob. M-O-B, just like it says, meeting a mob. They mean people. But believe me, our little Monterey Peninsula, if you get your little map of California out or your atlas, take a little look because of what is happening to our area. We have a beautiful residential section along the ocean called Pebble Beach. Marvin Davis came out from Colorado, best friend of Frank Sinatra, put Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford with William Rogers of the Space Shuttle cover-up on the board of 20th Century Fox. He bought half of Pebble Beach, and when Mr. Murdoch bought Pebble Beach, he put his money and owns 100% Pebble Beach in the area. Last week I was listening to a radio broadcast, a tape that somebody gave me of a broadcast on the origin of these movies, such as the Red Dawn, made at MGM with Alexander Haig on the board of directors, presenting it to the president like it was the crown jewels. Well, they said Clint Eastwood with Dirty Harry was a precursor of that kind of movie. He set it off. So Dirty Harry, I'm nothing against him, and he was very low-key until he got rubbed the wrong way because of his own business establishment, the council turning down his desire to fix his property, which I really don't think was fair. So he retaliated, and he will be our mayor for 2 years. And along comes Pete Wilson from San Diego, and I hope I have more to do on the San Diego scandals this evening. If not, we'll do next week. Pete Wilson is part of a ball of wax. Henry Kissinger was out campaigning for him. Gerald Ford, the same team. Pete Wilson became the senator from California, and he now is trying to redo the entire coastline. He came in with a plan on taking care of, in quotes, preservation of the coastline without the help of anyone at Big Sur. He wants to move in, so Marvin Davis has Pebble Beach. Pete Wilson wants to direct the activity of Big Sur, and in between we have Dirty Harry in Carmel. Pete Wilson became senator when the 30 million fertile medflies were flown from Peru, the ballywhack and home ground of Pat Robertson and J. Peter Grace Company, and goodness knows what contacts they have. 34 million fertile medflies were flown here so that malathion could be sprayed throughout the northern part of the state, and the CIA supplied the airplanes for spraying the people, and that media propaganda and the chemical activities that went on pushed Jerry Brown out of running for the Senate. See, we only have 2 senators, but they vote in a block. So whatever state you're listening to this, our Wilson is your senator too. And so Pete Wilson is pushing around Big Sur, as I say. Eastwood's in Carmel, and Marvin Davis owns Pebble Beach. And what they're going to do is take a choice area, and it is choice. That's why I moved up here. I absolutely love Carmel, and turn it into a Monte Carlo place for the rich and the very rich. It started out as an artist colony years ago. It was choice artist colony because it was so foggy and the weather unpredictable, and the houses were so tiny that they could live here cheaply. And, well, the rest is history. Now, in Carmel, in Monterey County, I mentioned just last week that Arthur Dunn has been singled out by Lyndon LaRouche to run against Leon Panetta. The San Francisco Chronicle had a large story. Democrats vow LaRouche won't win again, and they list all the California candidates, and of course they're the most liberal in the state. Sala Burton, Barbara Boxer, Roy Dullins, Pete Stark, Leon Panetta, Mel Levine in Los Angeles, Merv Dimely, and so forth. Now, they have put these candidates against them. Can LaRouche win in this area? I've mentioned it to you before. We have the 6th largest military establishments that anyone needs in this country, to tell you the truth. We have the Fort Ord, the Kashawa, the Navy Postgraduate School, the Presidio, where Lee Harvey Oswald got his language instructions before he went to the Soviet Union. 100 Liggett with the laser weapons that they have developed for the Star of War. They worked 20 years to get ready for the laser Star Wars at 100 Liggett. And the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies, which is a CIA training location, and the head of that is John J. McCloy, former CIA director under Kennedy. And the interesting thing, I might have mentioned this before about Art Dunn. I did say he's running. I happen to know the man in the area. But Leon Panetta lives in this area. I've corresponded with him. I've begged him, go into FRITZ KRAEMER. I've given him all the material. And, sharing offices with Daniel Graham of Star Wars. And, of course, in our area, Mr. Arthur Dunn is running against the fact that Leon Panetta won't support Star Wars. He lives just down Carmel Valley Road. It isn't 2 miles from my house. He's home every vacation and in and out in summer and holidays. His wife, Sylvia, runs the office down Alvarado Street. When he's in town, I'm allowed like 3 or 4 minutes to see him. You can do 23 years' work. You've got 3 minutes to say what you want and get out, and I get a very nice letter if there's any more I can do for you. He's 2 miles from me. I consider my work a national treasure. I think it's very important research. I have important things to say to him, a congressman, and now a man is put in by not only LaRouche, but the military. They're all part of the same package. We don't know how much money LaRouche gets from the Defense Department, and I imagine it's quite a bit for what he's doing. So the question is really silly, because all of you have your opinions one way or the other. Would Leon Panetta have ever sat down and listened to one World Watchers program in 15 years? He hasn't. So does he deserve Arthur Dunn as a candidate? Probably. I think so. He may not stop him anyway, and he may stop him totally. But the point is that people come along like Dirty Harry, and they move into area where there's more military to vote than anything else. The more, if they all registered and caught on, or if they're instructed to follow Arthur Dunn, we don't know his tentacles. He comes out of here from the East, Columbia University, an attorney and so forth. Although I've known him personally, I don't know that much about his military links. But I bring up the practical question of research. Who uses it if your own congressman doesn't use it? If he lives 2 miles down your house and doesn't even know, except for an occasional hello, what you're trying to say, how well can he represent you or me, and how long can they survive when the bulldozer comes along? Same way all the farmers voted for Ronald Reagan. How long can they survive if they don't know about Ronald Reagan and what he did to the farms in California? Now, I bring this up because this morning on the news, it was Channel 7, ABC News, David Hartman was introducing, he had 3 people from Kent State talking about the anniversary of Kent State isn't until May the 4th, when the National Guardsmen killed 4 students and wounded 9 others. But he introduced the president of the university and the artist who had a visual image of a monument that's going to be put there. And the conversation was interesting to me, particularly because Kent State was a sore point in my research, or a bitter point, because it was the height of the Vietnam War. Things were happening in this country that were so terrible. And when the National Guardsmen shot down these students, 9 were shot and 4 were killed. Instead of getting angry, the American people went into a shell. They didn't have shooting of this kind in this country, and they didn't have the courage that it developed in these dictatorships to stand up, and many die before you get the truth. But the dean of the university, his name is Dean Michael Schwartz, was on television, and one of the students who was shot was on television, and, as I say, the architect, and they were talking about the monument, and Mr. Schwartz was asked by David Hartman, what will be the response, to put this in, this Kent State memorial? It's been a long time, a whole new generation, and what will be the response of this 16, 17 years later? And Mr. Schwartz said the support on the campus, on the community is very good. He said, and this is so important, I hope to provoke questions. I hope there is an inquiry as to what happened to Kent State. I hope people ask questions about what happened here, about the quality of their lives in America today. And that's exactly what I've been trying to say, 15 years on the air, 23 years of research. What is the quality? What does Kent State mean to you in 1970? How can you relate to that to 1986? What do you feel about that? Because, you see, we're spending, already acknowledged, we've put $1 billion into Nicaragua. We've put $1 billion into El Salvador. This is all run by Henry Kissinger and Fritz KRAEMER and that gang. Kissinger was given Central America by Reagan after he messes up Middle East and Southeast Asia and Africa and South America. We have spent about $30 million the last 3 weeks for exercises in the Gulf of Sidra to provoke one of the smallest people on planet Earth so we can get more weapons going. In 1970, I was very active politically. I started my first radio program in 1971. I was active in the Peace and Freedom Party. As a matter of fact, the man running against Dirty Harry, the man who ran out of the race and gave it to him, this Paul Laub, was an Army intelligence G2 while he was disguised as a hippie during this period. My friends and I went through this whole thing. He was selling the India-Burma cloths and the paper to wrap your smokes up, you know what, and bought the first sandal store, the one and only sandal spot in town. That was his first purchase before getting a lot of expensive property here. The one who's blowing the elections, turning it away so that he can give it to Clint Eastwood, getting out of the race. It won't, as I say, won't be divided. So I went through all this locally and politically and was doing research at this time. But people were so frightened by Kent State that they withdrew. They went into their shell. I thought they would wake up and say, hey, it's not only Vietnam, it's America. But they didn't. 1970, what had passed before these 4 students died? John Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Jim Garrison had arrested Clay Shaw, and the Ohio people wouldn't help him. Governor Rhodes held back the extradition of Gordon Novell, an important person not only in the Kennedy assassination, but today with his offices in New Orleans and the machinery he does with John DeLorean, traveling around and getting him off, and the connections of DeLorean to the highest echelons of government. Now, Governor Rhodes is running again. Former Governor Rhodes is running right now, March 18th, 1986. There's a long article in the Washington Post. Ex-governor tries comeback in Ohio. He's the man that gave the orders that told them to shoot at Kent State. He's the man that wouldn't extradite Gordon Novell and helped Jim Garrison prosecute Clay Shaw with their links to California, to Edgar Eugene Bradley. Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese kept him in California. There are links to Reagan and Meese, to Governor Rhodes, to Gordon Novell, to the murder of Kennedy. It all goes back to that. And in 1970, the people all hid. They put their heads between their legs. If they're going to shoot in America, forget it. And let's get on with matters, just as they covered up the story of Kurt Waldheim that was always available in the National Archives. They covered up the Nixon era, the Kennedy era, the Nazification of America, and you see it progresses every day to get worse. It doesn't get better. In 1970, that same year, was when Joseph Jablonski of the Mine Workers Union was murdered with his wife and family. The Chicago 7 trial was going on, where they were convicted for crossing state lines that they could use later because they went to a convention in Chicago in 1968. That was when the American troops went into Cambodia, the incursion that Nixon brought in. Nixon put in by the Lincoln Club, by Howard Hughes and the Hughes organization in California. And after the Kent State shooting, there were 2 black students killed at Jackson State, Mississippi, which was covered up by most of the major media. And in 1970, Henry Kissinger signed the papers to spend millions of dollars to kill Salvador Allende in Chile, and Henry Kissinger is still the floating ambassador of the United States with his finger in every dirty, filthy pie that's going on, and that's why I want to know about FRITZ KRAEMER. And as I say, Nixon gave the orders for the Cambodian, and it was close to Governor Rhodes for the whole Watergate story. So the history that this not the professor, he was once a professor, he's president of Kent State, the history is important. He said, I want to provoke questions, and I hope that we will ask what happened here in Kent State in 1970, and how about the quality of our lives today. That's what he said. Luckily, I taped it off the TV. I love the video recorder. A listener, a long friend, and his wife got it for me, and I can capture those moments, because you can't read an article that doesn't go back to the past to, we'll say, the murder of John Kennedy, and take it up to today. And now a university president is asking about the quality of our life. Is there a relationship between that? And while he's asking that, Governor Rhodes is running there in Ohio and has a very good chance of being reelected because of the scandals of the Democrats in their links to Marvin Warner and the bank collapsing and the mafia connections. So you have 2 evils in Ohio. There isn't a lesser of two evils, but there's chicanery and dirty tricks and spilled money and banks closing and mafia and death squads, and also the headquarters of Permindex in Columbus, Ohio, and the teams that are sent around the world to murder. So the awareness that our quality is bad, I want you to sit here, students, and ask yourself questions, is a very first step, an important step to some of the problems today, to go back to that time period and see where those very people are today and recognize them and know what they did and know how they still are operating, running for office and influencing our elections. I'll take a 1-minute break and then continue now with some more of the horrendous news of the week. This is Mae Brussell, and it is the second half of a program called World Watchers. In case you picked it up in the middle of the first half, it is the second half of the broadcast, number 748. Now I want to go on to a few items of utmost importance regarding the space shuttle. The shuttle Challenger went down January the 28th. It was a Tuesday, so my broadcast waited 6 days. We couldn't push the week ahead. And the very first item I had on the space shuttle to discuss on the air was Ronald Reagan's ordering that shuttle to go, and it had to get off that day, hot or cold, because he was going to talk about Krista McCullough. And that still is the sore point of this investigation, and it goes down to the factor that these pieces of machinery can't and don't work in this cold weather, that this was a precedent that had never been set before. It was the coldest that they ever launched. They had known since 1982, 1984, 1985, the damage that the cold would do, how the engineers were forced to change and sign a piece of paper against their wishes, that the engineers always were the ones that had to prove it was safe, and the decision was left to them. And then the cold has been a factor, and the pressure on them has been a factor. And as I said before, the fact that they had no contingencies is impossible, that they just simply fell apart. If one shuttle goes, all of them goes. And the fact that there's such a busy business schedule doesn't make sense. If you need those 4 and you can't make 14 shuttles in a year, you can only make 8 or 10, you're sure not going to jeopardize one of the 4 and make sure that you can't make any. Didn't make sense at all, except that it was undue pressure. Now, the New York Times had an article, March the 13th, NASA urged Reagan to make a speech about the space shuttle with the teacher on it. It was on their mind, and this is the story that the space agency officials recommended in early January, that Reagan take note in his State of the Union message that the shuttle voyage of the New Hampshire school teacher, the White House officials said today, was mentioned. And the reason they wanted to talk about her was to hide the military part of the space program and make it look like it is a domestic national interest of ours, not international warfare or first strike capability, but that civilians are very much involved in the program. The administration, of course, Larry Speaks said that they never followed through, that the president pushed this aside and didn't consider this, and Pat Buchanan, who oversees the speeches, said it was a routine sweep of 18 agencies. I don't believe it at all, because they won't turn over their logs, and they spent 5 hours erasing any chance that's where the missing part is, the missing tape, that 5-hour lapse, so you're not going to find it anymore, as I said, in the Watergate tapes I mentioned before. Now, Dr. William Graham's name appeared on this request, of course, and he was just new to the agency. He was brought in just prior to the time that the launch was going to go down, and he's asking the president to talk about it. And the New York Times says, according to Mr. Thomas Buchanan, the only mention of the Challenger flight, the text that Mr. Reagan was to deliver on January 28th, was a passing comment on an experiment prepared by a college student that would be conducted in flight. Now, if you're going to talk about the college student, you're going to talk about the teacher, because he used this to get teachers' votes at the last election and brought it up very quickly. And Mr. Buchanan's the same one that says that there's no Waffen SS buried at the cemetery at Bitburg, and urged the president to go, and then the president is photographed around all the Waffen SS graves, and the picture hangs in the White House halls right now. The story in the New York Times is quite clear that the NASA recommendation was discovered just earlier this week when a congressional committee asked if such a document existed. They weren't aware of that yet, even though it's been on radio talk shows from the time the shuttle went, you can say went up or down, whichever way you want to figure it. And the official didn't know why the recommendation was not passed on, but Richard Nixon told you he never saw the men who were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. The space agency's proposal, according to the New York Times, said, "Tonight, while I'm speaking to you, a young elementary school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, is taking us on the ultimate field trip as she orbits the Earth as the first citizen passenger on the space shuttle," which is untrue again. There were congressmen and people from other countries. They were civilians and doctors and scientists. That was BS. But the budget was coming up the next week, and they needed to escalate the space money, which documents approved in the last 2 weeks. They were absolutely throwing down the sewer, the drain pipes, wasting the money, and pushing the Star Wars and that new space plane, which this week I read they're already starting the funding requesting for. So he was to talk about Krista McAuliffe's journey is a prelude to the journeys of other Americans living and working together in a permanently manned space station by the mid-1990s. Now, this week they are asking for $800 billion for the space station to Mars, the going off to Mars for civilians, which they say is a one-way trip, exactly Alternative 3. And I said when the shuttle went down, they'd begin pushing the Mars money, $800 billion. And they can't clean up the pollution in this country and get things straight, the priorities around. Mrs. McAuliffe's work in space, he was to say, is just one of the achievements in space that we have planned for the coming years. You can believe that. Now, the recommendation was January the 8th, and it said on the note that her flight, Mrs. McAuliffe's flight, is scheduled January 24th through 29th, and the speech was the 28th. The New York Times, March 13th, has that. Los Angeles Herald had an article April the 4th. White House was in contact with NASA prior to the launch. This comes from Santa Barbara, the New York Times. The White House said yesterday that several of Reagan's aides were in telephone contact with the space agency before the launch, but there was no evidence there was any pressure. Now, how can you believe any of that? These same people, William Casey and Fred Fielding and all of them, worked for Watergate. How do you believe these denials are part of the CIA? You have a denial ready so that's part of the operation. You don't do anything unless you have a denial, and they can lie through their teeth. White House spokesman Larry Speakes acknowledged the telephone conversations, but he said the administration was declining to release the telephone records and logs that were requested in connection with the Senate investigation. Speakes said that 9 White House staff members telephoned NASA in the 8 days before the launch. Well, the Saturday they were supposed to go and didn't go. They might have called that day on the 25th and said, is it dusty? On Sunday was, as I say, the Super Bowl. They may have wanted to put it off because of the competition of the media between the teacher and the budget coming up the following week for space, or that evening he was going to ask and give his presentation. It wasn't even the week. That was put off because of the death. He was to ask that very night about that fast airplane that all of us will take to Japan, probably never see, and the Star Wars and the space money and so forth, the warfare state speech. So there were 9 telephone conversations 8 days before, but the evening of the 27th and the 28th, there could have been 3 each of those, but 9 called, but we're not going to let you have them, and they said they had no recollection or indication they were related to the launch. They just say, hello, how are you, and so forth. The Houston Post had an article March 21st, Representative Senator Ernest Hollings stalks the presidential aides. And this goes into the fact, and this story broke pushing the issues around that he demanded the telephone logs of 9 presidential assistants, and they had to admit that those people were in touch with them. Hollings wrote to White House counsel Fred Fielding. Fielding has retired. The Donovan trial, Raymond Donovan, Secretary of Labor, is about to begin soon. Fred Fielding is getting out. He has strong links to all kinds of chicanery through the entire Richard Nixon Watergate affair. Why write to Fred Fielding, except William Rogers and Fielding are very close, so it's ridiculous for Hollings to write to Fielding. And he asked on the Senate floor for the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. We're being stonewalled by the committee's Republican majority in the Senate, and he asked please to open this up, that there were rumors that Ronald Reagan in the State of the Union message was going to talk about Ms. McAuliffe, and the NASA headquarters at the Kennedy Space Center and Johnson Space Center have been requested to turn over their phone logs to Senator Hollings. But the Senate is stopping him. The Republicans, it's become a Republican versus Democrat, which I mentioned before, because Reagan would be out of office. I should think something would knock him out of office. I don't know what it's going to take, but Senator Hollings' office is missing a certain point. They've asked NASA headquarters, that's the Johnson headquarters in Houston, Texas. They've asked the Kennedy Space Center for this information, and the key is Huntsville, Alabama, and Rockwell's offices at Downey, California. Those are the areas that are important to get the people down in Huntsville who are, of course, deeply involved and pressured, and then didn't feel they had the necessity to pass on to the top team, but the top knew anyway. And the representative for Rockwell International is none other than Michael Deaver, whose last big bash for Ronald Reagan was the Pittsburgh ceremony. He's very close to Nancy Reagan. He's the representative, the public relations representative for Rockwell. So they're not pressuring Rockwell to come out with the information. Now, The Guardian, a small newspaper, many of you know it, March 19th, their last issue, the one before, has an article, The Free World's Most Vicious Rumor, a very good article sent to me by a world watcher. And the article goes like this. Reagan administration is stonewalling the question. They have not answered, and the denials have been undermined by a widening credibility gap. The Harris poll, even that, a strong, staunch Republican group, is the people have not much confidence in the Presidential Commission. The majority don't have confidence. The Rogers Commission refused to take even the most uncritical questions about the White House. The Rogers Commission was appointed February the 3rd, and they refused to examine the telephone logs or otherwise the documents from the White House preceding the launch, and this cast doubt on the character and the accuracy of the people involved. This article goes on. There's a lack of authority of the Rogers Commission to issue subpoenas, and of course William Rogers, who shares law offices, Rogers and Wells, with William Casey of the CIA. Rogers has been linked to the mafia. An excellent article I keep wanting to get into in case you don't have it, from Sundance Magazine. His links to Richard Nixon and the Hughes organization in the Bahamas. William Rogers, who was an attorney representing the Greek military junta, the Nazis. A friend just sent me section out of a book of his role with that. And Rogers also worked closely with the drug enforcement team, the White House plumbers. And in the book Spooks, on page 143, a section called Assassination Incorporated, it talks about a cabinet committee with John Mitchell, John Connally from Permandex, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, Secretary of State William Rogers, and CIA Director William Helms. And Connally and Mitchell were indicted later for their Watergate crimes, but the working staff was Egil Crow, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, later went to jail. They were all part of the Watergate team, and William Rogers' law office was always entwined with those people, so you can't expect much from them. The Guardian article says Senator Ernest Hollings asked who in the White House was in contact with Canaveral, how were they in contact, what method did they contact, and who were they talking to. Now, this article makes up a list of 2 names, and then the next week the Guardian added a 3rd name of the highest level government officials in the intelligence, national security, and CIA, working with William Rogers on the whole space story. What they're trying to do is to save the presidency, like they did or tried to do at the time of Watergate. When they couldn't save Richard Nixon, they brought in Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission with Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. And I bring this up because the Rogers Commission has been stacked right from the very beginning. The Guardian brings out the names of these three people. First of all, they said the White House and the executive branch dominate the entire Rogers Commission, whereas the investigation to organized crime or the 3 Mile Island, the investigation of the nuclear mishap, had not objective people, but separated from the White House. Alton Keel, Alton-Keel, is the staff chief, brought in as the chief of the Rogers Commission. This article says he took leave from his job as associate director for the National Security and International Affairs on the Office of Management Budget. He's at OMB in charge of White House oversights for the budget of State Department, CIA, Pentagon, and National Security Agency, which of course would be the Star Wars, the space shuttle, the takeover of the military, moving the civilians out of the space program as far as you can. The second person on the staff that they cite is Thomas Reinhardt. Well, they actually have three names of the Rogers Commission. He's the second-ranking official under Mr. Keel in OMB, who worked for the CIA, the National Security Council, and so forth. Reinhardt explained that Keel, he's the spokesman, took charge of the Rogers Commission at the request of the president. The president wanted Keel in there, the president who was going to mention Krista in his speech. The third person they refer to as a Max Weinberg, because you see these names in the news regarding press conferences. Max Weinberg, the commission chief spokesman, is on leave from the White House press office under Larry Speaks, and of course that is Thomas Buchanan. And Anne Brackville, the White House spokeswoman, explained that Mr. Weinberg, right from the White House press office, has temporary work on the Rogers Commission, but that doesn't affect his relationship between the White House and the Rogers Commission. His word, in quotes, is our word. So he goes back and forth with Alton Keel to the White House, one from the OMB, National Security Council, CIA, and Pentagon and State Department, the other right from the White House with Larry Speaks or Larry Lies, and the Thomas Buchanan outfit in the White House. And the article says Weinberg's dual responsibilities are with A, the White House, B, the Rogers Commission, and Weinberg was asked who in the White House was in touch with NASA before the launch, and he got angry and he said that is the most irresponsible rumor in the history of the presidency, the most vicious rumor in the free world. That's the title of this article. The most irresponsible rumor and the most vicious in the free world. What about the unfree world? And then the Guardian says that Weinberger and Brackville have repeatedly refused to comply to questions about the White House contact with NASA by angrily denying that Reagan wanted to refer to the shuttle program in his State of the Union message. So Mike Royka is still asking in the Chicago Tribune, they quote him, wanting to find out about the speech, and that he published an article saying that there is no way, absolutely no way, it's completely out of the question. The White House told him to get a copy of the speech. And the article in The Guardian says there's new evidence of outside pressure to get the Challenger launched, that this keeps coming up, that the NASA manager at Kennedy Space Center said, we made a bad call when we said the Challenger was to go, but there was something weird going on here that night. Right from the beginning, we always erred on the side of safety. And this is a quotation, and Representative Edward Markey is trying to help Senator Hollings find out what went on. Now, The Guardian had another article on this March 26th, and they updated some of that material about Weinberger and the fact that William Graham said he urged the Reagan administration of the commitment to a strong civilian program, that on the national television the night of his speech, he should be urging publicly this strong civilian space program where you saw the next two shuttles would go up with the plutonium, and they knew it was dangerous, they knew the ship could crack, but get behind the teacher's petticoats and let's get going. And this next article refers not only to Mark Weinberger, I've given his background, but the Rogers Commission's two spokesmen for the RHODES Commission. One is Mr. Weinberger, and the other is Herbert Hetu, Hetu. That's a new name in this matter. Hetu refused to speak to the newspapers, and it goes on that Hetu is part of the Central Intelligence Agency. Among the Commission's perception managers, and they call them perception managers, how you see the event is what happened. They have this term, perception manager. Among the Commission's perception managers is Assistant Spokesman Mr. Hetu, who served as Chief Spokesman for the Central Intelligence Agency until 1981. Among other links with the CIA is Staff Director Alton Keel, who's on leave from overseeing the CIA budget for White House, in addition to CIA Director William Casey and Commission Chairman William Rogers, who was partner in the law firm of Rogers and Wells prior to Casey taking over the CIA. Rogers had a close connection with the CIA at least in 1984 when he was Deputy Attorney General, and he approved the secret agreement between the Justice Department and the CIA that gave the agency complete authority for investigating illegal acts by CIA employees, and for 20 years they managed this kind of work. This is the team in charge of the Shuttle Challenger investigation and what they call perception manager. The article says the RHODES Commission refusal to investigate the politically inspired aspects of the Challenger schedule is beginning to cause public concern. In a telephone interview, the Federation of American Scientists President John Pike remarked, one of the principal jobs of this commission, as I say, is perception manager, and that is a good word for it. The Daily World, March 1st, has a story, Did White House Force the Shuttle Takeoff? And in the newspaper yesterday, it's indicated from the Chicago Tribune and the San Francisco Examiner, April the 6th, NASA fly-by-night procedures shock the Space Shuttle panelists. A quotation, nothing in this program was coordinated with anything else, and it tells about what a rotten system it was, how nobody paid attention to each other, how they ignored each other, and the astronauts told about one horror story after the other. It was televised last week. You might have seen it. But that was April the 6th. On April the 7th, 1986, this morning's news, again by John Noble Wilford from the New York Times, U.S. moves towards shuttle successor. Now, John Noble Wilford is the fellow who wrote the article on the spaceship Challenger, this very one that was going to be turning the space program into military. He wrote it for the New York Times just within 3 weeks of after the Korean airline went down, when the Challenger was monitoring it. Again, with Mr. Truly, Richard Truly, who became the director of the shuttle program now. He's Admiral Truly, ran the Challenger circulating Russia and the islands when the House of Representatives, Larry McDonald, the John Birch Society was dunked. The Challenger was used then. And John Noble Wilford is the writer for Space Things in the New York Times. 1 week after all the hearings and the public hearings, goodness knows what went on, the president's ready to give money to the same people to improve the machinery. As I said before, they know what they want, and to get on with the story as if nothing happened. It's like Korea didn't happen, Vietnam didn't happen, Iran and Mossadegh and the Shah didn't happen, Klaus Barbie and the Nazis and the death teams in South America didn't happen. The survivors, of course, are under the Hughes organization, the Medical Institute, the FRITZ KRAEMER, Henry Kissinger. That's why those people are so important. They get anything they want, and they are altering us physically, biologically, through food, through atmosphere, through disease. And if we don't stop these people and go back to their specific origins and the power they've had, they will continue to do more. This shuttle didn't mean a thing to them. It didn't mean a thing to Rockwell or to Huntsville. Nobody will be punished except to switch jobs. They won't be identifiable. Now, one of the most shocking stories of the shuttle program is in the Washington Post, March 16th, 1986. Why I Blew the Whistle on NASA's O-Ring. And this is by Richard Cook. when the Rogers Commission had their first public hearings to show you, look, we're squeaky clean, see us, we're scientists, we're astronauts, we wouldn't hurt a fly, I'm the vice president of Boeing or the president of Boeing Aircraft, we are wonderful people, and we're going to find out how 7 people died and all these billions of dollars were thrown in the ocean. Trust us. And after those couple of days, Richard Cook was furious that they were lying, and he said, this is why I blew the whistle on the NASA's O-rings. Now, part of this article, and it's almost the whole page of the newspaper, but in the middle of it, he tells you, and I'll get to the beginning, but I like to get sometimes to the middle first, you know how I work. There's a section called the death document, and the whole article is about how they knew this was going to happen. And he tells how when he was at NASA, one person at NASA told him, step away from the door, because he was searching for another document in the filing cabinet, and he didn't want to see anyone in his office and later be suspected that he was the one that was caught or had gotten it. And he called it the death document. He said that meant if the contents were known, it would prove without any doubt that NASA was aware of the potentially disastrous problem with the seals for over 3 years. And Mr. Cook is saying, I'm going to tell you about this because they know it. He said another person told him of his fear that if the truth came out about those O-rings, it would be the little guys who would be fried. Well, 7 were fried, and little guys aren't yet fried, but they'll continue with their jobs because what they know, and if they can sanitize that, you can imagine they can sanitize the White House logs. He said in summer of 1985, and many of you know that, he had concern for the solid rocket booster that was used in the shuttle, and its history, what he said about it being catastrophic. And in this article, he said the engineers knew the O-rings were potentially deadly. They held their breath every time they went up. There were clear warnings that were discounted by the bureaucracy, the same bureaucracy that's going to get $3 billion to make another ship. If there's unemployment, Congress, go into your debt, give us a $3 billion and close all the American farms. This would save every farm that's being foreclosed if we would stop that forced shuttle and give it to the farmer. The article goes on, the NASA bureaucratic team were unable to accept any serious nature of problems, and they didn't want to be fully informed of them. The mid-level managers didn't pass it on. And I use the example of a nice man, a decent man, like Leon Panetta here, who doesn't want to be informed on what's going to the country. I see it right in my own neighborhood, 2 miles down from my house. Passes by the house every time he gets to get to his home just about, or to his office. But people don't want to be informed. Mr. Cook said February the 3rd, 1986, after the shuttle went down, there was a report from Marshall, Alabama, the Huntsville people, the Marshall Space Center, that they were not adequately responsive to headquarters' concern about flight safety. And they claimed there wasn't enough time for assessment of problems, and the engineers were improperly excluded from the investigation of the Challenger disaster because that proved to be a lie. And he said the purpose of this report is to show that I did write a report saying that improvements had to be made, that the organization milieu around the O-ring had to be corrected. Now, James Beggs came in from General Dynamics. He cites that. He came in 1981, right after Reagan was inaugurated. The Space Center was changed. He said it will be micromanaged away from headquarters, and there will be little central guidance or control. Beggs is under indictment for millions of dollars taken from General Dynamics. He broke it up in 1981. Now, this is 83 is when the Star Wars speech is going to be put in, and Edward Teller and Reagan, these people have cooked up this Star Wars since the 60s, since the 40s, since 1945. And now it is time to move to the next stage. He said there was lack of central authority in Marshall Center in Huntsville. The officials from there in particular were defensive. They are vague. They brushed aside concerns raised by the headquarters. They didn't care about. They were indifferent to the budget costs. The solid rocket booster office was downplayed regarding the safety raised by Marshall's own engineers and their own science and lab. So remember the second broadcast right after this went down, and I said, look, this was meant to go down. He said the promotion system was for yes men, whoever agreed and stayed cool and thought like the management stayed, and the others were sure to leave, and they were moved out. They said, we want positive talk. And then the article goes on to say that the filament around the case, the solid rocket booster, ruptured, and they knew that this was a big problem. The budget didn't support the improving of it. They knew it would be catastrophic. They didn't want to put money in. And in the hearings in February, when the Rogers Commission was going, and he heard what they were saying, they gave the impression they never saw the O-ring as a flight safety problem. They saw no problem. And that's when Richard Cook got very angry. If I run out of time, I may go back to some more of this, but if you get to a library and get the Washington Post story and copy it, I won't have to use so much airtime for you to get it. If you don't have a library that has it, I'll update a little more for the next few minutes. He said that the Marshall people in Huntsville and at the headquarters discounted the engineers' concerns. They decided in 1985 that the flights would continue in the face of known problems with solid rocket booster problems. And the testimony before the Rogers Commission, they were almost proud, he said. They could claim not to have been overly concerned, not to have been informed, and their justification that made him mad. Richard Cook was mad that they got up there and were proud of their decision to fly, that they wouldn't admit that there were major problems, that they knew about the problem. They didn't think they were serious, and after it blew up, they didn't think they were serious, and they'd probably do the same thing again. And it was the impact of their indifference, their attitude that there was no problem, the attitude everything, okay, will happen, the attitude if we have more money, we wouldn't have so many problems, and their attitude, well, so what, space could be dangerous. Those were the things that Richard Cook was seeing and hearing, and that's when he decided to blow the story. And the Washington Post, as I say, has this thing on the death document and what they knew, which just confirms that broadcast I had the second week after the shuttle, that it was meant to go, they wanted it to go, and that space would belong to the Star Wars people. Our time is up now. I had a lot more I wanted to share with you, but I think we have enough material for this week, and whatever we don't have time for this week, I will continue as I try to do. But these are terrible times because those people are crazy. And again, the Nazi, NASA, von Braun, Dornberger, Huntsville people go back to the Kennedy assassination, which is where I began my studies, and that's why it's so important to go back to that era and see where they're leading us today. In the meantime, we are out of the hour. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. Thanks for the books and the articles.